Hi, and welcome to a special episode of our Experiencing Consciousness podcast. We are
Roxanna Erickson,
Catherine Rossi.
And I'm Jan Lipa.
We are so happy you are here.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of our podcast. Today we are here with Dr. Catherine Rossi and Dr. Roxanna Erickson-Klein, and we are going forward with our series on addictions, and today's topic is alcohol addiction. So, alcohol addiction it is. Where to start with when we are actually talking about alcohol addiction in terms of our approaches, in terms of hypnosis, in terms of strategic or non-direct approaches? Where do we start? What's the most important thing?
I think where we start is it a problem to the individual, or is it a problem to their family? Is how you really start, because if it's not a problem with the individual, then there's not likely to be a change. And so It becomes really important, because alcoholism doesn't stand alone. It's within the context, it's within a social context.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement. And when someone comes with the expressed concern of alcoholism or managing their drinking, I spend a lot of time getting right down to the nuts and bolts. Well, tell me why you're here today. Is this a problem for you? Is it a problem because other family members complain to you about it? Or is it a problem because you're not happy with something that is going on in your life? And I think those key questions right from the get-go are essentially important. Because if the individual is not feeling like this is problematic for themselves, the likelihood of, change is really minimized.
Okay, so I'll ask a question in here right away. So if a person comes to you and says, answers those questions in such a way that it states, well, mainly my family has a problem with it, then is there something you actually do, or what's the strategy from that point on?
So you're saying if a family member has a problem, or a family member is complaining about the individual that comes in?
I would state the second. I mean, so you have a client who claims that, well, I came for a therapy and I supposed to say that I have a drinking problem, but
Okay.
my like, for example, my wife or whoever told me to tell you that I have a drinking problem.
Okay. Well, what I do is I skirt around the problem and say, what do you think why do you think that they said that to you? What do you think is bothersome to you? What do you think is worrisome to your family members? So I respect the statement that's been made and gather the information that's available from the statement that it has been made. But then I shift gears to, well, what's your perspective on this? Do you tell me how you feel, setting those family members aside, what does it mean to you? So Catherine, what is your approach into working with these?
Well, it's actually a little bit more indirect. And I mean, how I love to be indirect. And so that's why it naturally occurs to me where it doesn't occur to others. And I would have a tendency to say, oh, well, then what is your problem? What's more important to you right now? than this question about drinking. And so shifting them away from it, and I know that they're going to come back within the context of what they're saying about their current problem, is going to come back to whatever family member. In this case, we're talking about a family member that has a problem with it, to be able to then weave in the relationship with that person. And as they then are going to naturally describe some difficulties with them, then to return to, well, I wonder if there's a misunderstanding about your use of alcohol, if they misunderstand it or if you misunderstand it. So it becomes, a broader perspective. And the whole idea is that when a person comes in and they present this problem, but it's a problem from someone else, is how can we make this the most loving exchange of being able to, give and receive these kinds of pieces of information. And ultimately, people who do have drinking problems, they come round to it to say, well, I can be excessive from time to time. It's like, well, yeah, how often does that happen? Oh, well, no more than 4 times a week. Because they'll say it like that, this really calm sort of thing. It's like, wow, so 4 out of 7, man, that's like greater than 50% of the time. Do you think that might bother your wife? Do you think that's what she's talking about? So it's within the context of the relationship of sometimes the more indirect way. But what I do know is if a person does not consider it a problem for them, then it's not worth delving into. And I'll even say that, well, at this time, you're not seeing it as a problem, after you explore it. And so there may come a time that you do. You may increase, you may decrease, this sort of thing, but there may come a time where you say, this really is problematic. And just know that should that time come, that there's a lot of help out there for this issue. It's really well studied. So, to try to leave the person with questions in their mind about themselves and about the hope of the future. It's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And this is really interesting because there is a lot of going back and forth with direct and indirect. And there is a lot of intertwining of the, the social context, the setting, which, hypothetically is what brought them in with their own perspective. And so there is that process in gathering information and exploring the information to, to kind of weave around and weave back and forth. Do you consider it a problem? And yet you're certain that they consider it a problem. And I'm curious as to why they consider it a problem. And how certain are you about your behavior? What is it that you're doing that gives them the impression that, that you have a problem? And it's not unusual in scenarios like this where you find out that even though there is an identified client, that this one that we're pointing the fingers at as the alcoholic in the family, is that, at least some of the time, if not much of the time, there is actually family dynamics where more than one people is overindulging in a, in a problematic way. And so to facilitate the client to gain their own picture of that and to make their own observations and to reach their own conclusions, and to, as they're doing that, to make definitive choices for themselves. And right now I'm working with a young lady who was pushed into my office because she's, they declared she was falling down drunk, way too much of the time at every family gathering. And so I kind of review I review with her, okay, well, tell me from your perspective what happened, and, tell me what left them that impression or left them to make those accusations of you. And then with this particular client, it's like, it's a family, and it is a professional family. It's a high-powered, family who has influence in the community and very productive, very well educated. And yet every single family gathering of any kind involves what appears to be, or what sounds like, an overindulgence of alcohol. And so with this particular client that I'm working with right now, I've encouraged her to, to challenge herself, just take a step back and go for an evening with maybe just one glass of wine, just make that last the whole evening, and make your observations of every other person. And in making those observations, they're learning about themselves, because how difficult was it to ration myself to one glass of wine. And I don't prescribe the one glass of wine. I get them to declare what would be a reasonable amount. So I'm not telling them, what's a reasonable amount. I'm letting the individual decide. But to drink less than they normally or typically drink, to position them for better observations of family members. And that process of being able to observe other family members and the dynamics and the routines and the way other people encourage other people to drink more, and to come to the recognition, this was one of the most important things to this young lady. She came to the recognition that actually everybody's pointing a finger at her as if she is the problem, but she's just, she's no more of a problem than every single participant that's there.
That's really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And to help to create self-awareness.
So generally the whole family was actually involved in a problem, doing the same kind of thing, and only like creating a scapegoat institution or something out of her.
Creating a routine where this is how we have fun together. And one of the things that, that I've found with people who seek help for alcoholism is that, there's, as we've said, there's a variety of things that bring them into the office. And at least a big part of the time, what brings them into the office is the expressed worries of other family members. But the ability to take a step back and get a better understanding of that whole scenario is usually very, very helpful to the identified client. Now, for me, who's somebody who's trying to work with them, the step of, well, why don't you really cut back on your alcohol intake to position you to get a better view of what's going on with with the other people who are present. That actually is multifaceted in that it gives me some insight as to their willingness to, to cut back on a quote special occasion, their ability, and sometimes you find if I make a suggestion like that, someone is like, what I would consider the more difficult, people that have more difficulties, like, well, I'm not going to miss an evening of fun. I don't care what they're doing. I'm not going to cheat myself out of an evening of really, getting as free flowing alcohol as I want. Well, that suggests to me that alcoholism is perhaps, it isn't definitive, but perhaps it is out of control. On the other hand, if somebody, reacts like, gosh, that would be really interesting, and they may not be successful on their first attempt, but if they're willing to explore what it is to be sober or near sober at an event where where drinking is common, then it says to me, this is a person who actually has the ability to titrate their input in a healthy way, and maybe they need some coaching, some suggestions, some guidance to do so. But it's different from someone who really can't control how much they're drinking.
Yeah.
And it becomes very interesting that I'm thinking of a couple that I saw a number of years ago, and they came in because he was worried about her drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And she definitively said, I am not going to stop drinking. And so it was very interesting, and got round to the question with him is, how much drinking is too much?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, any.
Well,
and so she was having an occasional glass of wine or two. She was not excessive. And so the problem, so it's really interesting. So the problem was actually with him, and what he wanted in his ideal mind is that she would not drink at all. And what he wanted her to do, which I think is really funny, obviously that's why I'm laughing, is that he really loved marijuana, and he could describe to a T every form of marijuana and what it did, and the all of the terms and this and that. And she was not interested in marijuana, but from time to time, when she went out with a friend, she would have a drink. So they were coming to, I mean, this was like threatening their marriage. I'm saying this was a really serious problem, but and she wasn't critical of his use of marijuana. She wasn't saying it's too much or this sort of thing. She said, oh, well, that's just what he does. But finally he came to terms with the fact that he was actually being pretty hypocritical. Mm-hmm. That to fault her for having a glass of wine instead of having marijuana. And he came to terms with the fact that I can really see this. She's fine. She's just being herself, and this is not a problem. And as a result of him coming to terms with accepting her for who she is And she really did hold her ground on this one. She was not going to give up something just because he was demanding it. So I learned a lot with this particular case of, being courageous to ask the questions. And, often we don't ask the question, well, what amount is too much? Or as you observe them, how many glasses are you seeing them have? And if they say, well, one, if they say, well, six, it's like, well, six is a lot, isn't it? Especially depending on, well, six in any size is a lot. But the willing to be really open and not coming prematurely to a conclusion of is it or is it not alcoholism, I think is really important.
So
I
actually,
agree. And it can go in the opposite direction of people saying that, they only occasionally have, just one or two drinks. And then when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it's like, describe to me, the process of you having a drink. And sometimes I can think of several women who have come in to say that I like having a glass of wine when I prepare dinner in the evening, and explaining to me there's nothing wrong with having a glass of wine as I prepare dinner and a second glass of wine as I eat dinner. And I'm sitting there thinking, no, I would agree with that unless there's something else going on. That is not a problem. So why are you here? And then it turns out, and this has come up a number of times, is that I black out and wake up in the morning and there's the empty bottle next to me, and that's happening 3 or 4 times a week.
Well then.
So,
unconscious drinking, isn't
it? So then I can respond to him, well, that's a different story. You're right. There's nothing wrong with those first 2 glasses of wine. But the issue seems to be on what happens after that. And from my perspective, and I don't mind being opinionated as a therapist. I know some therapists think that they should just be a blank slate and never be opinionated. But I am outspoken. I think that if you're drinking to blackout, this represents a problem to me, and I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't. Even if you don't think it's a problem, if you're drinking to blackout, it's, it is what I would consider to be a problem. And that's the feedback that, that I am going to offer. And so it's one of the things, since I've been working in this area, it's surprising to me how many people routinely drink to blackout, and often, several times a week, and yet they're still functional. And that goes on for a number of years, and there is a tendency to decompensate and go downhill after a number. It isn't, definitive that that's going to happen, but it certainly is concerning if somebody is drinking to blackout, even if they're able to hold on to their job and they've never had, a run-in with the law, or even if their family isn't noticing it, it's still what I consider as a health professional. I consider that problematic. Yeah. And sometimes people are willing to work on it, sometimes they aren't.
I've got a question here, because from what you say, I noticed that sometimes you are very direct with these clients on some occasions, and sometimes you are indirect. Same with Dr. Catherine Rossi. So my question is there any rule to that? I mean, to what extent and in what contexts, or with what parts of the therapy, within what parts of the therapy, one decides to be more direct with the message or more indirect to that kind of clients?
It depends. I mean, that's the best way to describe it.
Really?
It's individual according to the client. And thank you, Roxy. I've learned now to ask a new question, which is, do you ever drink until you're blacked out? I've never asked this question, and I will in the future. Thank you. It's a good one. What I say to clients is that if you are walking across a train track and a train is coming, I'm going to yell at you to get off the tracks. I'm going to be very, very direct along those lines. And so if I'm saying something very direct, if someone were to say to me, yes, I black out 3 times a week, then I would be saying, which is very direct, is then you really do need to consider if you're an alcoholic. I'm not calling them an alcoholic, but you really need to consider this. You need to consider what else you want to do in life. What special things there are to do, the relationships that you have with people that you love, of when you can spend more time with them, and and where do you want to put alcohol in your life? Or do you think that maybe you should take a break from alcohol? So, which all of that is very, very direct. So I would say, in terms of thinking about the 4-stage creative cycle, in stage 1, it's like, what is the question? So I would not necessarily be direct when it's in the what is the question. When you get into the working through it, depending on if a person is genuinely stuck and they're not moving off into new ways of looking at things, I might then make some direct suggestions about, well, I mean, what about this, or what about that? Where you're still, it's in the form of a question, but the questions have a tendency to be a little bit more direct. When it gets into stage 3, which is the aha, I'm listening carefully to what it is that they learn and what it is that they want to do. And then there might be some very direct suggestions there, such as what Roxy said to the young woman of, what's a reasonable amount of wine to drink at a party, and so that you can really carefully observe. And she said 1 glass. So it's like, okay, then, so to be able to help to formulate kind of a plan, which is stage 4. So, and so all along, there's opportunities to be direct and to be indirect. And I think a good therapist has the ability to do both. But the most important thing is that unless a person is asking for a clinical diagnosis, then it's all just a question. But if a person is asking for a clinical diagnosis in this regard, and if they tell me that they black out 3 times a week and they want a diagnosis, that diagnosis is going to be alcoholism. Because I don't have a doubt about that when it comes to that. So, so it's like, what you're asking, Jan, is really like the process of it. And most of that is then how people are receiving it. It can be so comforting to receive something directly. It can really be comforting. And an element that I think about in working with people like this is that, when one needs to metabolize alcohol, your brain isn't working to optimal capacity. In other words, people aren't necessarily in the ability to be able to think some of these things through, because just because they're not under the influence now, it takes a while for the alcohol to really leave the body, and then it's affecting that. And so comfort is important, but also sometimes really having the a direct way of working. So like I say, it depends, but I gave you kind of ideas of how I work through these things.
Would you add some? Mm-hmm.
I agree. It depends. And the what I've found is that direct, even confrontation, is once you've established a trust, obviously you have to get trust going before you're going to be getting honest, unfiltered answers. But once you've established some degree of trust with the client, it's a lot more efficient to gather information with direct questions, with direct. But even those direct suggestions, like how much do you think it's reasonable to drink over an evening? And if they say 6 glasses, then I'm going to respond, oh, I'm not a drinker, which is honest. I'm not a drinker, but 6 glasses seems like quite a bit to me. And so that's an indirect suggestion. And I've lowered myself to the know-nothing position. I'm not a drinker. I know nothing. So we're depending on this individual to be the expert. But I've raised the question indirectly that maybe their assessment isn't all of the information. Now, there's a few things that I do in working with this population. I have a few little gimmicky phrases that are easy to remember, and people gotta grasp onto them. And one of them is and I don't even know where it came from, but that old saying that man takes a drink, drink takes a drink, drink takes the man. And by the time, I even have a little graphic of that, but by the time drink takes a drink, you're talking about, that the alcohol is forcing decisions that weren't made by the individual. Now, so there's one little, gimmicky little saying that I, tend to throw in. One of the other ones that I tend to throw in my interactions, and I do it repeatedly, not every session, but, maybe every 4th or 5th session. But one of them is that the first thing that happens once you take a drink is good judgment just flies right out the window. And so, so you may feel like you're relaxed and everything, but I say that as if it's definitive that your judgment is compromised. And I stand by that, and I always get respectful, attention to that. I just, mention it in passing. That doesn't mean you can't have a drink. It just means that, judgment went out the window, flew off. And I try to say things like that with a chuckle and a smile and a friendly way, and indirectly get their attention to, I wonder what the validity of that statement is. So if you're wanting to promote change, that indirect suggestion is far more effective at promoting change. You may be way more efficient in gathering information. You may get more accurate information with direct. But if you're trying to promote change, it essentially has to be indirect, because it has to be the subject's own observation, the subject's own decision their own willingness and desire to go forward on a different path. It has to be.
And isn't that also in understanding of bringing the unconscious or subconscious mind to the conscious? Is that, so when the judgment has flown out the window, for instance, and so you want to indirectly wake up the unconscious mind to make it conscious, so that a habit can be addressed in awareness.
So you don't make it.
So one of the things that I do with individuals, I don't, as a general rule, I don't even ask them to limit their drinking. I, discuss it. I give them the opportunity to. The only time that I ever do is if they have been court ordered, to remain sober.
Mm-hmm.
Then I do request that they, comply with their terms of their probation. And then I remind them that that's no alcohol. And I would strongly recommend that you comply with all the terms of your probation, particularly abstinence from alcohol, for the duration of these legal proceedings. So I'm not asking for the rest of their life. I'm just saying until these legal proceedings get ironed out, I'm requesting that they do, abstain from drinking during that interval. But then I also, at the same time, I do say that relapse happens. And, and what's most important to me is to know what we're working with. So if you relapse, just be honest, and we'll get it figured out and we'll work through it. And then I put a little bit of emphasis on, relapse is a very common sequelae to somebody who's trying to give up alcohol. Relapse, it's very, very common. And it really doesn't even matter if you relapse. What matters is what kind of response you make to the, you can make it into a mountain or a molehill. So if you have one drink and immediately, whoops, that wasn't, that wasn't a smart choice. My good judgment went out the window. Then you can cope with it, and you can, redirect yourself.
Yes. I mean, and that's really excellent, because I think that as we're talking about alcoholism and how you work with alcoholism, it really requires a lot of sensitivity. Mm-hmm. And that in all that you're describing, Roxy, it's really respecting that client, and that doing this dance between direct and indirect, and making the relationship, making the bond, and asking for the principles of honesty, and also telling them very directly, the court has ordered you to do certain things, and I am encouraging you to comply with all of that. And I think that, it becomes really important so that people can, it's like contain it. Like, that sometimes you do have to build a fence around something and contain it and be able to hold it in your hand. So I think it's really excellent. You had a question, Jan, I think.
I had few, but I'm forgetting about them when you go into more deeply into the conversation. I got some more additional questions, and so the last one that I have, the fresh one, is so we what you said is that we need to be really kind of attentive, I would say, and empathic towards these people. So my natural question would be, are there any particular special information or things that we need to be really, attentive to, or take care of, or look for or pay attention to? Are there any set of guidelines here?
Well, one very common thing is that, as I said, if the alcohol is in the system, good judgment does tend to be compromised. So that's one kind of fundamental principle that, that is being worked with. Another basic principle is that, if the individual isn't seeking to modify their behaviors, the probability of them modifying their behaviors is really minimal. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon for substance users in general, alcohol being one of them, to lie about it to themselves and to others, to minimize. I didn't have that much to drink, and so when you're asking questions, if you want to know what you're dealing with, you have to be more direct and say, how many drinks did you have? For what period of time? And are we talking about the gallon-sized cups, or are we talking about the little shot glasses? So you have to be really, specific and really direct, because there is this natural tendency to minimize and to forget, and to, and sometimes to be blatantly dishonest. That's just part of what I say is that actually that's part of the alcoholic syndrome, is to be untruthful about it. But so there is another little gimmick that I've used very successfully, that and I'll tell you about it in the context of one of the individuals that I'm working with, who he's a young man, and he's got a legal disaster on his hands, so he won't be able to legally approach alcohol for the next several years. But he's from one of these families, and he does have good, loving family support that gets together every holiday and weekends and this and that. Everybody else in the family drinks. So this is problematic, because he's got cravings. He was telling me that, it was somebody's birthday and everybody was enjoying the champagne, and he wished that he could have some, and he chose not to, because he is motivated and, to get himself through this problem that he found himself in. And so one of the things that I had said to him is, so his mother is there and his grandmother was there, and his mother and his grandmother each have a glass of wine for dinner every single night. And he says, so when we sit down to dinner, I look over at grandma, I look over at mom, and they're enjoying their glass of wine. Sometimes they even have two, and it makes me angry and upset that they know I can't have any, and they know what a big problem I've got, this and that. So I gave him the homework assignment that choose one, and he chose his mother, that choose one. Notice what time your mom pours her glass of wine. notice how she drinks it, how long it takes her. You know, is she sipping it over an hour? Is she guzzling it down within the first 5 minutes? You know, what's she doing? So notice her behavior, notice if she takes any refills, and notice what's it doing for her? How is it shifting her behavior? And so he did that at homework, and he came back in the next week, because I don't see everybody once a week, but if they've got legal problems, I do see them every week. So he came in the next week, and he said, I did the homework. And he said, you know, my mom poured the glass of wine. It was 15 minutes before I went up and touched her lips. And I just expressed interest. Oh, and what did you notice after that? You know, tell me more. Tell me what you noticed. Well, what he noticed was that his mom was just, it sounds like she just wanted to take the tension and the edge and like the flavor, you know, and so she turned a glass and a half into an evening long, you know, sipping event. And so when I asked him, you know, you know, what do you think? Why do you think the wine is so important to her that she won't just stop? Why do you think it's important? And he says, well, obviously she's just able to, you know, to take it slowly and enjoy the relaxation. And then I looked at him and I said, you never learned to do that, did you? And he said, absolutely not. I would have guzzled it all down the first minute, poured some more, and drifted into the deep drop. And I said, oh, well, you know, at some point in the distant future, once we get past all these legal snafus, if you have any interest in, you know, revisiting alcohol, that's something to remember. And he just looked at me and he said, I am never having alcohol in my life ever again. It's caused too many problems.
But what a wonderful.
Yeah. And I just said, good to know. Really pleased to hear that. But it, by taking this really indirect, circuitous route of the observations that he made and conclusions that he reached, even though I punctuated it, you didn't learn to do that, did you? You know, it did force him into self-reflection and self-awareness. That's not what alcohol was for him.
Yeah.
And I believe that when you really want to know what is the treatment, it really is self-awareness and self-reflection, and to bring the choice into it. And so that's really beautiful that he could observe his mother, but still his resolve was very different than that. And what I wonder is, did he continue to be angry when he would see his mother? And that's what I would figure, is that would take away that it's not that they were not taking care of him. It's that they were able to drink modestly and moderately. Yeah, but that is the self-reflection and the self-awareness. So that you can make a choice about what you're doing. And you know, I think that that really sums it up.
That's true.
Well, and really, one of the most important things is to, you know, in the therapeutic setting, is to, I think of it as coaxing people to be more honest with themselves, because there is a natural tendency to minimize. There is a natural tendency towards denial. There is a natural tendency towards, you know, lack of awareness. And if you can coax them into self-honesty and coax them into more reflection and self-awareness that, a lot of times these things just find their own new direction.
That's a great summary. We did quite a lot on this episode, although I have one more question in mind, and I'll ask you the question, and so we decide if it's just a simple answer that it's needed here, or do we want to do a separate episode on that subject? Because I've got one thing lacking here, which is the role of hypnosis and how to use hypnosis in the treatment of alcohol abuse. Is that something that we need to address now, or is it a topic for another episode?
I think that's a topic for another episode.
I would agree. Agree.
So I thought. So thank you very much for today. Thank you very much for this outstanding episode, and see you next time. This was another episode of our Experiencing Consciousness podcast. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jan. You're the best. Be well, be happy, celebrate life.